Welcome to the Human Origin Project, where we explore the science of you. To keep up to date, go to our iTunes channel and subscribe, and please leave a review if you enjoyed today's show. Hello, and welcome to the show. Today is the first Human Origin Project podcast, and Stefan and I use this opportunity to explain to you how our own journey and thinking has come to really exploring the true story of humanity's past. We talk about great thinkers in humanity's past and the knowledge that we use today as potentially an appropriation of our very clever ancestors and where this all came from. And if we misunderstand the context of where knowledge comes from, it becomes very confusing. We don't know how to apply it. So that becomes a very interesting mix of the scientific and the philosophical, which really the Human Origin Project is about. We are all about discussing the evidence of, where things came from, but then we have to dive into the why. The why is very important, and that's something that modern science isn't so good at explaining. And so the purpose of today's show is to give you a little bit of an introduction to the way we think and also how the platform operates, and to really encourage the people out there that are interested in these topics to participate, ask questions, and submit your own work to the Human Origin Project. So I hope you enjoyed today's first podcast episode of the Human Origin Project. Hello and welcome to the Human Origin Project. This is our first podcast, and I'm Stephen. I'm here with Stefan, and today we're going to talk a bit about the Human Origin Project, where it comes from, how we began talking about it, and a lot of the different lines of evidence that brought us to begin to work on a platform that helps bring forth the conversation of where humanity came from and about our past in general on planet Earth. Steph, it's exciting to be doing our first podcast.
Yeah, it's exciting to finally be behind the mic. I think it's been so exciting to start and to get this all going and to finally have a tangible place to bring all our ideas together. And I mean, we've been talking about this for years and been interested in it, and it's really nice to have a space to be able to, throw everything that we've learned and have other people come in and talk about what they know, and really open this conversation not only to ourselves but to the world. Like, there's such a worldwide community of people interested in this.
Yeah, that's what we really found, isn't it? That the internet helps you to be able to connect to people thinking in the same kind of wavelength. And we really kind of just started talking about this in terms of like what we were interested in, right? And we'll talk a little bit about that today. But it's funny how concepts and how especially when communities come together, there is usually a sole purpose, and everyone's kind of just curious in this whole area. And that's more or less, how we started talking about this stuff, is that we're both just kind of curious people that kind of ask questions, and that really and also we're both skeptical by nature as well. So we dig into, is that real, or is that, set in any kind of, scientific evidence or tangible things that we can cross into. And it just becomes this whole conversation, doesn't it, that really does take in your life.
Yeah, definitely. And I remember the first time that it really resonated with me. It was about 3 years ago, maybe. I went to Stonehenge, and I'd never really thought about ancient history. It was always just reading about pyramids in textbooks and that sort of thing. But being at Stonehenge and seeing these stones, are just kind of like, I had this kind of like wow moment. Just how did they do that? Why did they do that? What is going on? Like, millions of people flocking to these stones every year. Why? Like, what? And then you start looking at the people that were involved in building it. We don't even know who they were. We don't know how they did it. And all these question marks started appearing. And then it's just like this endless path of trying to understand why it was so important to build these sites, and why they're so revered today. Like, there's something still about them that draws us in, and it's just curiosity.
Yeah, completely. And I remember that trip we took there, because we were just looking at all these kind of lines of discussion about, what the ancients were doing, what we really know about ancient history. And when you go to Stonehenge with the idea that you're going to learn more, you really come away with more questions than answers, don't you? I mean, the answers you do see is that, wow, they knew a lot. And that really kind of fills you when you go to the sites and experience what they put together. What really kind of, I remember when I was there, looking at the structures, looking at an understanding, for instance, when you look at what people have written about why they were put together, the understanding of, for instance, the solstices and the equinoxes, and a knowledge of astronomical bodies and movements that really we don't understand very well today, or we don't record or appreciate today. And it just led me to more questions, and I was just thinking, why would they do that? And then it leads you to the question, how? Like, how on earth did they do this? These huge stone blocks, like when you see them, it's just, you can't put it into a modern day context. And I know, they've put modern day, reproductions of how the stones were put together and built, but to me, I look at that and it doesn't make sense. So there was always more questions after we visited the site.
Yeah, definitely. And I think from that, and I started trying to look into, who these people were and why they did this, and what was going on back in ancient times. And I remember coming across Hamlet's Mill, a book that was written, I think, in the 50s maybe, or the 60s, that sort of takes this idea that all these stories that we have, it focuses on Shakespeare and the story of Hamlet, and how all these stories, at the basis of them is astronomical knowledge, but a way of bringing that forward throughout history and through time is by telling stories, and using that as a way of encoding this really profound astronomical knowledge, which is similar with Stonehenge. It's all astronomically aligned. It's all to do with the heavens and the stars. And there was something going on where that was at the highest point for them. That was one of the most important things.
Yeah, that was a concept I remember we were talking about early, and Hamlet's Mill kind of came up as a book, and this idea that, these stories encoded this information which is why it resonated so much with people. Shakespeare, prolific playwright and writer, but the reason why his concepts were so revered was because they had these concepts in them. And then you see them also linked into ancient sites and buildings, and all of a sudden you're starting to see this body of knowledge that we don't really understand today. There's no explanation of why Shakespeare is so important. We kind of break it down in very, if you think about your 7th grade English class and breaking down Shakespeare, you don't talk about the astronomical knowledge of it, do you? But that really kind of started the conversations like, well, do we really know this? And then you just kind of keep going down trying to find sources as to where these people got this information from.
Yeah, and I think until you understand where it's come from, until you've got that context, it's hard to build an understanding of what it's talking about. I mean, you can understand the story, but if you don't know its origins and what it's really trying to convey, it's kind of, you're missing half the picture, which I find is the more you look into these old sort of ancient mysteries, the more you find that there's a lot of this information that the further back you go, the more that you find there is kind of hidden, and that's sort of blurred through time.
Yeah, that point of understanding context is so important. One thing that really I kind of found that affected my career, I'm a dentist as with a healthcare background, I dealt with a lot of diseases and conditions that we deal with today in society we consider normal: tooth decay, crooked teeth, and putting braces on kids. And what really was a breakthrough moment for me was when I saw anthropological texts and studies that looked at the history of dental disease and jaws and teeth as the marking point of humanity. That's what anthropology is built on, jaws and teeth, because it's the most stable and most calcium-rich anthropological records that we have. And so that was never taught to me in dental school. And so I was brought into the world of a dentist named Weston A. Price, who wrote a book in the 30s that showed, hey, people that don't eat traditional foods, as soon as they eat the modern diet, they get dental disease, including tooth decay at their modern rates, but also crooked teeth. And crooked teeth was a real kind of mind-opening, one of those moments where I was like, whoa, what? if you think about what we're told about orthodontic braces, is that kids are just destined to get crooked teeth, and they need braces put on their teeth to fix it. And that's what I was taught in dental school. Basically, you can identify and fix crooked teeth, but then there was a whole body of knowledge out there that showed the crooked teeth didn't happen, and it's the same concept as wisdom teeth impactions, where the jaw doesn't grow, and then you have to take out the wisdom teeth at roughly the age of 20. But when the jaw doesn't grow, the teeth don't fit, and once you kind of flip your mind to that, all of a sudden the whole thing changes, and then there's this whole body of scientific knowledge out there showing us that craniofacial growth and breathing, and so for instance the teeth that sit in the maxilla bone, all has an effect or a consequence when the jaws don't grow properly. So when you don't breathe right, you have sleep apnea, and so we're in a breathing epidemic now. And you can prevent these things in kids by fixing their breathing, fixing their oral function, fixing the nutrients in their body to help them grow bones. And it was one of the biggest health problems on the planet that I really hadn't seen that way. It took me a long time to understand it, but it was the context that flipped it. As soon as that was flipped in my mind, I was looking at it differently. And that's why it's so important. You can be doing things completely wrong and not understand it unless you have that anchoring point from where we came from.
Yeah, I think that's such a good analogy as well, with crooked teeth, putting braces on compared to understanding the function that caused that in the first place, and relating that back to these ancient cultures and these ancient practices and this ancient knowledge. Until you understand the context of where that comes from and how we know what we know, until we understand that, we're not going to know. It's going to be hard to understand it in a modern day, because it's a similar thing. We've got these kind of like band-aid bits of information and snippets of knowledge here and there, but we don't understand the big picture and where it's all kind of come from and originated from.
Completely. And I remember reading Price's book, Nutrition and Physical Degeneration, and he went around the world into these cultures and he looked at what the modern diet was made up of. And what he found was that they revered the foods that would create a round head in a baby. And they would say, eat these foods 6 months before conception, you have a child with a round head. That's as simple as it is. But the thing is, a kid with a round head has a better developed jaw and base of the craniosacral system and better airway. And so now I've got a 7-month-old, and when
he's got a round head,
little bobble head. But when you understand those principles and you see his craniofacial development, this is what we do in the practice now as well, is that we pick up these problems at the start. You can untie these growth problems that then will enable him to grow a jaw that fits 32 teeth when he's 12 and older. And so once you untie those issues, but the thing is, I discounted it as this very kind of like basic knowledge. It's like, oh, you eat the foods and you get the round head. But there's this whole other health layers to it. So you don't get chronic disease, you don't get sleep issues, you don't get immune issues because your teeth are strong, your immune system is strong. Fat-soluble vitamins relate to calcium balance, but also the immune system. And then we talk about the gut, and when you don't have bacterial imbalances in the mouth, you don't have bacterial imbalances in the gut. We know that's all connected to every chronic disease now through scientific evidence. We've only really discovered this in the last 10 years. So they were talking about a much deeper set of principles. And I took it at a very superficial level then, but when you go deeper, you understand they understand things far, far more than what we did.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the really interesting things about working on HOP and working on with this community, is that there is this body of knowledge out there that is so fundamental to our existence, and that there are these kind of little snippets that keep appearing in modern times. And now that we have this scientific lens to look into ancient cultures and into ancient practices, there's a lot of instances where there's proof that ancient practices like meditation or like sun gazing or these things that have been talked about for thousands of years, there is actually a scientific basis to them. And that I think it's such an exciting time to be looking into these things, because there's so much to learn from our past, and you can't really dismiss these things as ceremonial or sacrificial or, you know, things that have no merit, because now that the science is coming out on them, it's really important to understand why we've been doing that for thousands of years and why that's beneficial for us as people on this planet.
Yeah, completely. That marrying of science and ancient legacy, losing the idea that ancient people were primitive, I think is a very important point, because once you lose that idea, your mind completely opens to a world that really goes far beyond what we know today. And the great thing about we've really had a scientific revolution over the last few decades, you know, in terms of how we apply technology to data, to understanding, you know, the inner workings of DNA and the microbiology of the body. But we've got the tools now that explain it to us in our modern context to understand what they were talking about. And so what we're kind of building is just this huge body of knowledge, and it's all just learning, really, in the end. What I mean, what I was going to say is that that there was, going back to Stonehenge as well, and you know, when you talk about those equinoxes, and there's a lot of people that have written about this stuff, hasn't there? And
yeah, there are, and I think that's been a really interesting thing about working with the Human Origin Project, is that until now, you know, you do your own research, and there's really amazing people doing studies, and they're collecting evidence, and but there's no real platform for all these ideas to come together, which is, I've found really exciting, because I read these kind of really obscure studies and obscure books, and it's like, well, what do you do with that? Like, you know that now, and then you move on and learn something else. And I feel like it's been really important to start drawing all that together and building a story and building a coherent sort of narrative that brings in everything. And it's cross-disciplinary. You know, we're focusing on, you know, ancient practices, but then modern science, and it's kind of a balance between what we can study today and what we know and what people knew in the past and what they've been talking about and how that can relate to us. And kind of like, yeah, it's just a really nice community that we've got ourselves going here. Completely.
And one thing about modern scientific research is that a lot of people will say about certain concepts, oh, there's no published research on that. It's like, well, for there to be published research, a researcher has to understand fully all of the factors that are affecting, let's put a disease. Let's talk about crooked teeth. So some people would have argued that nutrition, there's no published research to say there's a link between diet and crooked teeth. It's like, well, yes, that's true. But do we know a connection between vitamin D deficiency and calcium homeostasis? And yes, we do. We know conditions such as rickets. So kids will develop bent limbs, and this happened. This is where the discovery of vitamin D deficiency happened during the Industrial Revolution, is when kids were deficient in vitamin D and they had these bowed legs because their body wasn't metabolizing calcium. So we figured out you give them cod liver oil and you recover the vitamin D. But the craniofacial system also uses calcium homeostasis, yet we don't link any vitamin D to growth of the craniofacial bones. And we know that mothers' vitamin D deficiency links to a newborn baby's vitamin D deficiency. We know we're in an epidemic of vitamin D deficiency. That's just kind of the surface of it. None of that has been studied in public research because we don't understand the link between craniofacial growth and nutrients, so forth.
And that's, again, looking at the big picture, like, not, instead of isolating, you know, teeth and talking about teeth, you're looking at the whole, the way the jaw develops and the brain develops within the body, and the connection to the gut and the connection to your mother in the womb and what she eats and what it builds this huge picture that you need to, I guess you would know more than I do, but you need to understand the big picture to understand the fine details of it.
That was completely it. And that was my process in going through and understanding that. And that really taught me to look at things with a broader lens. And once you kind of take in all of that information, so you take disciplines from the ear, nose and throat, you take the anthropological data, you take the nutrition data, you take the what the biochemistry, and then you take all of these things and you put it, you read it and you think about it and you understand, and then you can see when people eat the wrong things, how that happens in terms of craniofacial growth. So like when we don't understand those contexts and when we don't understand those concepts, we get stuck in systems that are wrong. And when you go back to Stonehenge, you kind of look at something that we potentially don't understand. Well, can we somehow pin that back? And there is books writing about, for instance, the Greeks and how they talked about astronomical alignments. And so, for instance, there's a guy, John Michel, isn't there, that wrote a lot about that in terms of the knowledge encoded into Stonehenge.
Yeah, he was just a really curious guy who wrote a lot about especially the English landscapes, and how Stonehenge was one example of a series of megalithic sites that sort of spanned almost the whole of the UK, from standing stones to stone circles, underground chambers, burial mounds, all of these things. It was part of like a huge network of ancient sites, and he was just really curious. He documented them all. He measured them. He found that there were links between the size of the stones in Ireland and the size of the stones in the UK, and that they all kind of matched in their astronomical alignments and the sort of stones they used. And no one really knows why, but there are these links there, and there is this old understanding and knowledge that span not only isolated areas but almost created this network across continents and across almost the whole world.
Yeah, and when you go to the UK with that view of understanding their megalithic culture and what was happening there, you see, 70% of Europe's megalithic sites are located in Ireland. I never knew that before I went and started looking into this, and you see these huge structures, Newgrange, and they're all over Ireland, and they have these same amazing alignments to that they measured the cycle of Venus, they measured the solstice. If you go there on that day, same as Stonehenge, there is an alignment where the sun shines straight down the structure of Newgrange. It's remarkable, really. And it's this same knowledge, isn't it? It's this same understanding, and then all of a sudden you're starting to see this pattern. You see the huge standing stone sites across France, similar concepts to the UK, yet there's no, and we can just write that off as ancients putting silly stones up. But when you look at it in that context, it doesn't really make sense, does it?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the really interesting things, that there are these flashes of knowledge that are popping up and resurfacing. And I mean, a lot of the modern pioneers of science and physics that have come up with these ideas that are sort of mind-blowing and takes a long time to be accepted as scientific theories, but a lot of these people have studied ancient practices and have really looked into the old cultures and what they knew, and adopted that to further our modern science. But a lot of it comes from a basis from ancient, that the ancients seem to understand, or seem to at least talk about.
And these are some of the most influential people on our society today. We're talking about people like Isaac Newton, who wrote the Principles of Mathematica, which in the 1600s became the basis of what we learn in schools today. And so, with Newton, he was known to be quite this reclusive, strange guy that would spend a lot of time on his own. But what he would do is he would basically break down, do experiments on light, and he understood the electromagnetic spectrum, which was not understood then. And he would also sun gaze, for instance, and his equations and mathematical principles all came from this understanding light. But what happened was that in the 30s, it was found that he was a big proponent of alchemy, which is a very strange link, and you might go, what does that have to do with anything? But alchemy has its roots in ancient Egypt, and so there is an idea that Newton was pinned to this ancient knowledge that came out of Egypt, and that you can follow that line from Egypt to the Greeks, which is what our modern society is built on. Plato, all of those things today. You know, Plato writes the basis of our political system, of our religion, of our ethics system. We use all that today, yet we don't try and find where Plato found his references from. And something you never do in the scientific community is you take an idea without referencing it. So, and I think as well, it's dangerous to use ideas without knowing where they came from, because without knowing their full context, you don't know exactly what they do.
Yeah, and with Plato and a lot of the ancient Greek philosophers, they would spend a lot of time in Egypt learning from the Egyptian priests, because Egypt was seen in ancient times as this area of high knowledge, and where all these ancient practices sort of culminated. So the Greeks would go learn and return to Greece with this insight, and Plato was a descendant of that sort of legacy. But then what I've found really interesting with Egypt is looking at where they got the knowledge that they had, because we still can't produce the pyramids today, or if we could, it would cost billions. And who would take that on? Because it would probably take a whole lifetime to build.
The pyramids of Giza are just, when you look at them in that context, and after we went to Stonehenge, that kind of really changed my lens on how I looked at these structures. And it is just out of this world what they produce there. And, you know, the 2.5 million blocks, and the 200-ton stones lifted up in the middle, and aligned to potentially there's archaeoastronomy there that it's aligned to the cardinal alignments of the planet. It is just mind-blowing, and we couldn't do it today. That comes from an engineer's perspective. There's no way. The other thing you have to ask is, why would they do that? Why would they lock a pyramid to true north, and why would they go to so much trouble to build a structure that is so accurate and so so aligned to the principles what they talk about, for instance, of nature? And then you see the same things at Stonehenge, don't you? Like, for instance, alignments to solstices, equinoxes, and that there seems to be this knowledge that they're encoding into it that we don't really have a grip on today. Yeah,
definitely. And the pyramids are one of countless examples in Egypt of this insanely high knowledge and this skill and this almost obsession with perfecting and building in line with these sacred principles that they had with numbers and the solar system and the stars, and having their culture and their civilization built to fit in with these old ideas and that they are part of something bigger. They're part of the solar system. They're part of the galaxy. And I remember reading a book by I don't think I can pronounce his name, Schwaller Lubitz, who wrote The Temple of Man, which was a book about this temple in Luxor, which seems to encode all of the scientific knowledge that they had, all of the mathematical knowledge they had. It's just got insane depth to it.
Yeah, that was a real breakthrough. Like, when I saw that, and when you look at what he paints out is encoded into the Temple of Luxor, you're talking about deep mathematical principles, and he talks about how the Egyptians, in their language, in the hieroglyph system, that binary maths is built into how they speak and how they think. And then we understand today that binary maths is the basis of computing and coding.
It's crazy. Just that point, thinking that they were teaching their kids computer code, like, it doesn't make sense for us because we're so far removed from that. But to them, it was so simple, and that having that understanding, I think, is how they were able to build these perfect structures and harmonious buildings and things that really, you look at them and it's like music cast in stone. Like, they're so proportional to each other. And it's just this understanding of these basic principles of mathematics that taught from a young age.
And Schwaller was a deep scholar of both anthropological science, but also this idea of esoteric knowledge and this Egyptian body of knowledge that he was trying to show had this deep scientific basis to. So he spent it was nearly 10 years at the Temple of Luxor with the French army, and with the disposal of a rich wife, that he could basically research and bring out these amazing books. Like, they're so thick, it's unbelievable. But and it's so dense the knowledge he brings out. But he shows the temple basically follows the growth of, for instance, the phylolactic growth of a young pharaoh, and so how the body grows and how these principles in nature of human growth is related to how a plant grows in nature. And we know that happens. There are mathematical principles in the Fibonacci numbers and the golden ratio, and how flowers, for instance, span out in this set of numbers. And the same thing happens in biological creatures. For instance, a face has a set of proportions, in golden proportions, where we find certain things attractive. And that tells us things about the genetic information about the person. And when you see someone with good genetic information, you find that attractive, and that becomes a standpoint for wanting to mate and pass on genetic information. And that's all nature just doing this amazing process. And they seem to understand that. That's what the Temple of Man really kind of brings out, is that there was this whole body of knowledge there.
And also not only the binary mathematics, but also an understanding of the physiology of the human body. They've got detailed drawings of the eye and every single aspect of the eye and all the nerve endings.
The 8 nerves, yeah. So the columns in the head, there's 8 columns there to represent the nerve endings. It's unbelievable. And
even detailed descriptions of the pineal gland and things that we're only catching up to now in modern science. They had a very advanced knowledge of, and it's fascinating.
The most sacred temple room in the Temple of Luxor is where the priest would go, is where you can phylolactically, biologically place. So, for instance, when you walk in, it's the feet of the pharaoh, and it goes through time as well. There's all the different pharaohs contributed to the Temple of Luxor, but then the most sacred room, you can then relate to the pineal gland, which is the center point of the brain. And there's no explanation as to what the pineal gland does today. Health professionals don't get that, but there's a big body of scientific knowledge that shows us that how crucial the pineal gland is to everything. And they seem to think it was crucial. We're now just discovering that it's crucial, yet we've missed where this whole idea came from. And it really shows how you can completely be knocked off where you came from if you just don't understand where the problems come from. And the Greeks really followed the Egyptians, and that's really where these ideas kind of let out and got really somewhat diluted into the Romans, into where we are today. And when you follow that line, you can see how you lose these things, and we're in a little bit of a collective state of amnesia, aren't we? Where we forgot where we came from. Yeah,
definitely. And I think that, you learn in school, this is a maths equation, and we learned that from the Greeks. And it's sort of you just accept it, and you kind of think, all right, the Greeks knew maths.
They discovered maths.
They discovered maths, yeah. But then the more you look into almost every aspect of science and physics and astronomy, it all ties back and back and back and back. And the interesting thing about Egypt is they had this huge body of knowledge, but they themselves said that their civilization was a legacy handed down to them, which is interesting because when dynastic Egypt first appears in the archaeological record, the language is fully formed, the hieroglyphic system is fully formed, which doesn't really make that much sense. You'd think that it would be a development into what they were, but it was almost as if it started as this perfect system that slowly degraded over time. And you can see that in the structures they built. The oldest pyramids are often the most beautiful and the most perfectly aligned and still in the best condition today compared to the ones that were built later, and as this knowledge was sort of dying off or being forgotten.
Yeah, the cycles of Egyptian culture is known now. And the other thing that really kind of spruiked my interest into how much we don't know about Egyptian culture, for instance, if that was the foundation of where our modern knowledge comes from today. So we know, for instance, that the foundations of modern computing was known in Egypt. Like, that's known, yet we've not attributed that. If you think about the archaeological record that we've uncovered in Egypt, we've barely scraped the surface. Barely 10% of what we know today is what lies under Egypt. And so there's all this history there that we're probably just scraping the surface. And if you think of the iceberg model, you know, looking at the iceberg from the top where 80% of the iceberg lies under the water, you can't get a grips of what the whole structure is about unless you see where, you know, how it's floating and all of its structure that's causing its buoyancy underneath the water. And we've had these little snippets come out and we're just lost from the point of origin, really. And even in some of the most critical aspects of our life today, for instance, electricity, like where does that come from? Well, Nikola Tesla was really the one that brought the use of AC current, and that was via understanding of what he would call principles of Vedic physics and understanding how energy works. And this is the same things that people like Albert Einstein was tapping into. And we don't really attribute Tesla so much as being so crucial. It was more
Thomas Edison, wasn't it? Yeah. But Tesla lived his life by these old principles. He used to do these bizarre things like turn a light switch on and off 3 times or walk around a block 3 times before he entered a building, because it all linked into these ancient numbers that he was so sure were the building blocks of all knowledge. So if you tapped into that and you lived your life by these principles, then you could gain access and insights to these really advanced scientific principles that maybe you wouldn't if you weren't in tune with the ideas. And I think all these little snippets of information were the inspiration for us anyway, with Human Origin Project, to start sort of categorizing the pieces of information that we had and building pillars that we could draw research and draw ideas into, and sort of start putting together a picture and a story. So I guess, yeah, looking at these old scientists and these old ideas.
Well, I never knew, for instance, that AC current could be attributed to Tesla, who was a scholar of, or someone that was very interested in, you know, the Vedic texts. So, like, that to me is a big missing. You know, for me, I want to understand what the Vedas, tell us if that's what Tesla could do with that information, and then so. And there's lots of these breakthrough people. Like, for instance, Einstein, he had his big breakthrough in 1905. He published, 4 to 5 papers in that time that changed the world, that ended the war, changed the world. It's still, I mean, Einstein is the man to talk about. Well, he's probably the most well-known scientist today. And so what we attributed him to, and his breakthrough, he was a nothing. And then all of a sudden in 1905, he downloaded this, he came up with this information about, the 4 papers to do with the molecular basis of atoms, which we'd never thought about. Relativity, that was a whole breakthrough that he would end up, he won multiple Nobel Prizes. But there were a few papers that you don't just publish breakthrough papers like that out of nowhere, right? And we attribute that as the discovery. But if you think about it, it seems like he was tapping into these principles.
Yeah, definitely. And there are still instances of this high knowledge today in old cultures that are still living. I mean, there's the example of the Dogon tribe in North Africa, who seem to know things about science and astronomy that they shouldn't know, without modern telescopes. Things like the orbital periods of certain planets, and when certain constellations rise and fall, and when and not only that, but also an understanding of what atoms are, and understanding about waves and protons and particles, and all these ridiculously advanced things that you don't think a primitive tribe should know, but they know about it, and they even talk about things that precede modern science. So there is still this knowledge being preserved in some cultures, and it's really a lifelong. It has to be almost an obsession to start looking at it all and trying to work out, where did they get what they know, and how does it even work?
Yeah, the Dogon is such a great example, because what some people have found is, and that was studied extensively through the 20th century by anthropologists, and what people found is that they had this deep culture of priesthood that would hold this body of knowledge that they would allow people to kind of level up in it and learn and understand. And what they found was that these principles talked about astronomical bodies. So, for instance, Sirius is a binary star system that has a second, and they used to talk about the two sisters, isn't it?
Yeah, there's a story in ancient Egypt about Isis.
So we should probably, before we go to Egypt, there's a story in the Dogon where we have the two gods has sisters, and what they're referring to is the star system Sirius as having a second star. And what Carl Sagan and 20th century astronomers discounted that to as Jewish missionaries teaching them that and telling them there was a second star. But what has now been shown is that their myth goes far. We call it myths. I don't like that word because it completely discounts. It's just knowledge, science. And so what they found is that their creation stories and their knowledge, their priesthood knowledge, actually takes you through the fundamental mechanics of light, of atoms, of the orbital periods of Sirius, stuff that they, goes far beyond just knowing. Missionaries can't just tell them that. And so this silly idea that we just discount it as this fluffy little story they would tell their children really does take away what they're really trying to tell us.
And the anthropologists that studied them, that we have almost all the information about the Dogon through these studies. It took them over 30 years of living with the Dogon, up to the point that they got, when the researchers passed away, they got given a Dogon burial and they were initiated as part of the tribe. But it took them that long to get to be trusted and to be given access to all this information. So people have gone, I think there was a Dutch researcher, Van Beek, who went to try and show that, to try and recreate this study that went on, and he only lasted a few years, and he couldn't find any examples of this. He couldn't find any examples of this esoteric tradition that the Dogon had in this high knowledge. So, but it kind of is counterintuitive, because you're not going to find out this secret knowledge in a few years. Like it's a lifetime, and that's kind of what we've discovered. It's kind of like this is going to be a lifelong obsession to try and understand and work out the story. Absolutely, and that really goes back to Einstein's story that he had this big breakthrough in 1905, but he spent his whole life trying to understand the things that he unearthed in 1905, from joining special and general relativity to quantum mechanics. And so one of the papers that he published in 1905, which he would win a Nobel Prize for, was that matter, travels as a photon, as energy. And then so what that unearthed later in the 20th century was this whole world of quantum mechanics. And what he found was that the principles, Newtonian physical principles, physics, the mathematical principles of the world we see, the planets and so forth, don't apply when we go to this very small scale. And he could never reconcile this. And I think the problem is potentially that when you don't really kind of pull in the full context, and when you think of like the Dogon, for instance, they talk about these very, very small particles, and they also talk about astronomical bodies as well. So they actually had this full system, and that when we look at it in this modern sense, we lose that anchoring to why we're doing this. Because we've become so specialized, haven't we? In someone can study their whole life looking at, going back to talking about medicine, studying the teeth. They know they could be the most knowledgeable person on teeth, but they might not understand the mechanism that makes teeth crooked. They might not understand how teeth are meant to develop or what happens before you have teeth. And if you apply that to this world of ancient cultures and knowledge and physics and consciousness and all these things that the Human Origin Project we're talking about, I think it's so important to understand the whole picture, is to have the whole picture and to look at it, to take a step back and look at the whole body and not get too carried away with the very precise details. Yeah, completely. And that's a problem I think that Einstein got stuck in, is he was trying to reconcile his equations to reconcile quantum mechanics and Newtonian physics, and he couldn't do it. And the problem was he got stuck in that. He couldn't pull himself out of that context.
And, those kind of problems have happened right throughout history as well, when you have these breakthrough discoveries and it comes out in a snippet. When you think of, for instance, the story of evolution and Darwinian natural selection and the origin of species. Darwin was someone that, he was a naturalist, but he basically just went around the world, just understood a lot of different biological systems, and he wrote these principles by which biological systems advance forward. And when it was done, there was no knowledge of what DNA, what it does in the body, or what it is in the body, and there wasn't even a knowledge of biological hereditary, so that you can inherit things from parents. We didn't understand. We understood the principles, but we didn't understand exactly the laws of it. And that was Mendel's work before, who was discounted. And so one thing that does happen in this whole area is that people get stuck in one little principle and they say, well, there's no evidence for that. Well, people like Mendel, people like Darwin met a lot of resistance to these ideas because we're trying to put them into a box, into a context that doesn't fit into the whole scenario.
And it's so hard to change someone's mind. If you've got your mind set on something, you've got an idea, changing that perspective is so difficult, and it takes a lot of time. And even people like Galileo and these people that were ahead of their time met so much resistance. And you couldn't even talk about Earth not being at the center of the solar system. But now it's taught in schools, like it's completely normal.
Copernicus wrote about it, but was too afraid to publish it because he knew he'd be lynched for it.
Yeah, exactly. So I feel like there is a bit of a shift happening at the moment with our perspective on things, and that a lot of the things we know and that we talk about are missing. There's a piece of the puzzle slightly missing, and it's just changing the framework and understanding the context. And I feel like that's been a really exciting thing about Human Origin Project, is that we can have a platform where we start changing our perspective and start understanding the context through this wide range of information, and talking to people that are doing research in really interesting fields that might not have the option to speak to a large audience. And we are trying to have a space to bring people together to talk about these ideas and to learn and just keep teaching and keep researching and understanding. And
recalibrating that really sacred knowledge into one direct. Because one thing I've found too is that all of this information comes back to a very simple and very pure source that seemed to guide all of these ancient cultures, and whatever happened, however these great minds made these breakthroughs, these principles were guiding their breakthroughs. When you think about the Copernican Revolution, the idea that the Earth, for instance, is the center of the universe completely changes your mindset, doesn't it? That completely locks you into the idea that everything that happens in your daily life is the most important thing on the planet or in the universe. But then when you understand there is a universe and that our planet revolves around a sun, that's a whole awakening, isn't it? And at the time when Galileo published that, he was persecuted for that, and it took a long time for the church to really acknowledge that the Earth was a body moving around the sun. And we're now in the situation where there's a lot of scientific principles kind of sitting there waiting to be acknowledged like that we're just ignoring because we're stuck in an old system. And every single one of these great innovators, Newton, Tesla, Einstein to a certain extent, Galileo and Copernicus, certainly Darwin, they were all absolutely their ideas were nearly shot down because, and people like Mendel never lived to see the recognition of their work. And so we do get stuck in these systems because we don't step back and look at the bigger picture. But I think overall, we've covered, why do you think that we've forgotten this all? When you look at the concept of amnesia, there's a lot of different medical cases, for instance, where you see people block out memories or they forget things physiologically for many different ways. So it's interesting to kind of think of humans as a species with amnesia, and people have written about that. But when you look at these little lines of what we use today and what we understand about the world, it does seem that we are in some state of amnesia, doesn't it?
Yeah, we live day to day with like you walk over and turn on a light bulb, but you don't understand where, you start looking into that, you don't really understand where that originated from, and that happens everywhere. Our whole world is built on these fundamental principles that we don't really understand where they originated. And I think once you start to understand them, once you start looking into where they originated, everything just clicks into gear a bit better. And I feel like it's a mixture of understanding that and understanding these ancient cultures and these ancient civilizations, and understanding where we fit into that, where our consciousness sits. All these little things help to put together this coherent sort of idea of us and where we're going, and remembering, the things that we might have lost.
It does feel somewhat, like all the research I've looked at over the last few years, I look at it and it makes so much sense once you understand it in that context. It does feel like a remembering process, which is really interesting.
Yeah, it's like when you wake up and you don't really remember a dream, and it starts kind of coming back, and then you get another little hit of information, and you're like, oh yeah, that's right. And yeah, I feel like I know what you mean. It's like it's just these little flashes that you can kind of hold on to and keep building on and understanding.
Well, the concept of deja vu, for instance, that feeling that you've been somewhere before, or but I feel that everyone's kind of following that instinct, that where there is something there that we're trying to remember, and that's why these things resonate with people so much. And that's why, for instance, we've found such a big community around the world looking at these things. And yeah, I'm just really excited. You always, when you find someone that has done great research in these kind of areas, that you can see that it's profoundly affected their life, and that it embodies them. And capturing those moments and finding those people that have done that good work has really been, I think, one of the most rewarding parts of this, because one, I understand the process that they go through, because the love that has to go into finding the pure research that isn't miscued in a way where there's mistakes, or to keep it correct, but also in a way that it's communicated for good. Ultimately, a lot of this information, when you think of the Einstein example, he used his knowledge to stop, well, one, there was the use of nuclear weapons, which you could say potentially questionable, but was that a use of to stop a force that was miscued? Maybe. It's really interesting when you start to see, how can we realign all this information, and can we use it for good? All right, man. So I think that was a pretty good first episode. So one of the really important things I think we've found to set out with people that ask about the Human Origin Project is, what's it all about? And really, what we've gone through is what it's meant to be. It's meant to crack open that shell that you've been stuck in, for instance, and start to look at things with a much wider lens, and just be curious. So that ultimately, that's what we are, right? We're just two curious guys that really enjoy ancient cultures and research, really, and sticking our heads into strange books.
Yeah, definitely. And I think having a space where you can have these conversations, and I know for me, I love talking about these topics, and I find it tough to talk about other things because it feels like there's no real meaning or depth to it. So it's nice having a space where we can share ideas and expand on old knowledge, or expand on new scientific knowledge, and just bring it all together and help each other understand what it's all about.
Great. Yeah. So next week, why don't we have episode 2 talking about the different categories of hop and the scientific fields that we're covering, and so forth. Thank you for listening to today's show. For more information, you can read the full transcript, articles, and discussion on our website, humanoriginproject.com. You can visit us on social media at Human Origin Project on Facebook and The Human Origin Project on Instagram. Follow us on Twitter or join the forum boards and email list to keep up to date with all the new information. And if you enjoyed today's show, please subscribe on iTunes and leave a review, because it helps others to find this information and helps us to bring you the topics you want to discuss and hear about. Until next week, I hope your life is filled with happiness, healthiness, and harmony.